business leaders, in a sense, treat cyber as this kind of dark art. And as a result, that gets outsourced from understanding the risk to the CISO. If someone were to actually dig in and kind of like understand the risk, they would be terrified. They would be forced into action.
When you were sitting in the seat of a CISO, what did the job of a CISO really feel like?
To be blunt, you're in a sense being constantly torn between trying to be like this visionary leader, and the other is in a sense this digital janitor.
I've read about your security theater. What do you mean by that?
Theater is kind of like a byproduct. The fact that folks are not willing to kind of dig into the underlying aspects of these risks, nor are they necessarily forced to.
One of the things that resonates a lot with me is that security budgets, they swing from famine to feast after an incident.
Because we live in this kind of cycle, it's really impossible to build no operational maturity. It's this kind of thrash cycle that is what actually burns out a lot of really good CISOs, right? Because you can't live in thrash.
You've mentored many security leaders. If a first-time CISO called you tonight and said, I'm about to take my first role, what should I not screw up? What would you tell them?
Maybe I talk them out of the job, I don't know.
Today's guest is someone who's been in my ear for the last year, pushing, challenging, and sharpening how I think about security leadership. Tyson Kopczynski, veteran CISO, advisor, investor, co-founder of Professional Association of CISOs, and most recently, investor and advisor at Axari. If you follow his writing, he doesn't really play the typical LinkedIn game. He writes about some of the most important topics like security theater, famine-to-feast budgets, burnout, and what boards usually get wrong. I'm really looking forward to this conversation. Tyson, thank you so much for doing this with me, man. Let's get into it. So you and I have had a bunch of late night calls, and just to say the quiet part out loud, right? When you were sitting in the seat of a CISO at Oportun or running security at Aledade, right? What did the job of a CISO really feel like on a day-to-day basis?
In a certain sense, I would say there's like a certain amount of violence to the job with regards to the constant kind of context switching. To be blunt, you're in a sense being constantly torn between two different perspectives. One is trying to be like this visionary leader, right? Leading from the front. And the other is in a sense, this digital janitor, right? And kind of all the parts in between. You know, I think another aspect of the job is the fact that a lot of CISOs at their core are ultimately what I would call systems thinkers, right? So we're able in a sense kind of to pull back, look at the inner workings of a company, which is a complex system, and in a sense, exactly understand where things might go wrong within those systems. And so as a sense, you have almost like this second sight, right? That doesn't like turn off. You see it kind of right there before you, kind of like almost like a ghost in the machine, which in turns kind of turns you into this like hyper vigilant beast, right? Or animal. Right? You're always on. You're always on. And in the end, you're kind of seeing a company through a much different lens than what other business executives might be experiencing. I think the last thing to maybe kind of put the cherry on the top is there's almost like this gnawing loneliness to the job, especially for mid-market CISOs. As you kind of like sit in front of this ghost in the machine, you're often tasked to kind of deal with it without the normal support apparatus that a lot of other business executives often rely on, right? So you're almost completely alone and by yourself, but you're also doing it typically without the shared accountability that a lot of those executives share for other business decisions, right? And so you kind of have to rest with that, unfortunately.
Yeah, I've heard that bit from like many CISOs that it feels lonely. And
Yeah.
that's kind of like why we're building Axari, chief of staff, that will at least give you this moral support, I guess. So Coming back, right? Like I know we covered what the day to day of like a CISO role looks like, but there's
Mhm.
also this performance layer. And you just talked about that this is like you're constantly on, right? Or you're always on. And you've mentioned this before. I've read about your security theater,
Mhm.
like saying, right? Like what do you mean by that? When for people who haven't really read what you've written about security theater, I think that will give people a really good understanding of like what do you do as a CISO in an organization, and how does that relate to you being constantly on or vigilant, I would say.
Yeah. So theater is a major issue. But to kind of maybe roll it back a little bit, it's theater is not something that you should be doing as a CISO, right? Theater is a kind of like a byproduct of the fact that folks are not willing to kind of dig into the underlying aspects of these risks, nor are they necessarily forced to, right? Back to that issue with kind of like shared accountability. So as a result, what a lot of companies do is they do this thing called security theater, right? Which is basically essentializing or essentially prioritizing optics over like actual outcomes. And I know that that sounds weird, and the thing that you're referring to is I think I wrote an article a while back that, in a sense, wrote the or explained the board's experience in relation to security theater, right? But in reality, there's like many different audiences that this actually might play out for, right? And I'll give you like some examples, right? One is, let's say, like from a customer's perspective, right? A company might say on their website, like we have bank grade security. They might have the SOC 2 logos, right? And it's all to kind of give this sense of like safety and trust and everything like that. But when you kind of like dig underneath all of that, it's ultimately just maybe a checkbox exercise for the company, right? And it's to get maybe the contract signed or to get users to onboard as fast as possible. When if you were to kind of look really deep underneath, the security posture is not what it seems, right? Kind of like behind the curtain. Another really good example is maybe with the regulators, right? So a company might, drown them with audit evidence, policies, documentation, and everything like that. And it's this kind of minutia or life cycle of theater, right? It's just proving that you can kind of pull all of this information together, which means maybe you're good at writing about security, but you're not really actually doing security. And that's the preface around what the theater is and kind of how it plays out across many, many different companies.
Being a CISO, like, and maybe going into an organization as a VCISO or a fractional CISO,
Mhm.
how much of it is just managing the theater or like actually helping the org create a secure infrastructure?
It's in a sense both, right? The reason I put this emphasis on a lot of it is theater is because of the dynamic that unfortunately CISOs are thrust into it, right? So I kind of explained, at a high level what it feels like to be a CISO, but unfortunately the ecosystem itself makes the theater exist. And I'll kind of give you maybe three reasons why. One is almost like this willful ignorance, right? We as let's say an industry, the cyber industry or CISOs, we're currently, in my opinion, where finance was before Sarbanes-Oxley, right? Back then, a CEO could, in a sense, say, "I don't understand this, complex, finance magic. I'm just going to trust the CFO."
Yeah.
Right? Today, no CEO can actually say that about the money of a company, right? However, a CEO today can say that about cyber, right? And as a result of that, there's almost like this outsourcing of understanding, right? Business leaders, in a sense, treat cyber as this kind of dark art, and it's because they're not expected to understand the art, and as a result, that gets, outsourced from understanding the risk to the CISO. But unfortunately, the business kind of keeps the authority around actually accepting a risk, right? And then what happens is there's like this fallback to the bliss of theater, right? If someone were to actually, dig in and kind of like understand the risk, they would be terrified, right? They would be forced into action, right? And furthermore, they would become liable, right? If they didn't do anything, right? And so this theater allows them to maintain, in a sense, plausible deniability. As long as the dashboards are green, they don't have to ask the hard questions, right? That would kind of expose the actual risk that is underneath.
Got it. Got it. So what would you do though? Like, let's say you are an entrepreneur and like just used like in today's world, applied AI to create some sort of an application or a value proposition for your customers, right? And you're now like a growing startup as well. You have customers and you've convinced them to use a product and stuff like that, right? What would you do as a business leader to build security from day one and use that as like a base to do security theater on top of it, or look more mature, right? And actually be more mature internally as well in terms of security standards, right? Like how would that look like?
If I were to maybe boil it down to like two things, right? One is that shared accountability aspect. We always joke as an industry that security is everybody's responsibility, and in a sense, that's theater, right? If you were to change the dynamic so that that was actually true, so that everyone had skin in the game, that by itself is going to change everything, right? It's no different than the quarterly or annually objectives that everyone's bonus is based upon, right? And if you don't do these things to help drive sales, like I'm not going to get paid, and the company can't be successful, right? And so what you have to do is basically say, look, this truly is everyone's job. And as a result, if we don't do this well, we're not going to be successful. I think the second thing that I would probably recommend is that you don't view this as a technical problem as well. This truly is a business thing. Right? This needs to be run like other business functions, right?
Yeah.
Right. And so back to that kind of like loneliness angle of like a CISO, they need to be supported just like any other business executive, right? They need to have, the staff layer or operating layer around them in order to actually execute success.
Yeah.
And again, I'm not saying like these SOC 2s or like, these things are not important as far as like illustrating trust. I think it's more important is if you're building something within the core of the company, the DNA of the company around how you're actually going to operate security, that changes the dynamic drastically.
I think looking at it from a business standpoint is more, I would say, convincing to a lot more people to look at security, I guess, because people right now, as you said, think of security as a dark art, right? And think of it as like just it's just too technical. I don't want to deal with it until I bring on someone who's a security expert. And it's not that necessary, right? I think implementing some basic practices from ground up and understanding about that, for instance, data governance, access control, and all these secure practices, understanding what it means at every layer, right? It's not that difficult. I think it's not just about implementing a security technical practice within, right? So it's two things, right? As you said, like there's one is mindset, and the other thing is how can I create a business layer around security as well that helps me to do that.
Yeah. How do you operate it?
Yeah, I hear you, man. I think that is more like a macro and a micro in itself for security both. Covered together. So I think this just to kind of like piggyback off of that, right? I think the other topic that I also wanted to talk to you was budgets and burnouts, right? I think if you look at like the overall budgeting issue that we see in security, and like one of the things that is like that resonates a lot with me is that security budgets, they swing from famine to feast after an incident. And I just want you to like unpack that for me. Like, what does that do to a program and to a CISO? Like what is this terminology where you get like incredible amount of overfunding before or after an incident, and how does that work? And like just to help me understand that a little bit, and I think unpack for everyone, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, well, to be blunt, what you just illustrated regarding that cycle causes thrash. Like, just like put it in front of people in that type of perspective. Unfortunately, a lot of programs exist a majority of the time within that famine part of the cycle. And when you're in that kind of famine part of the cycle, you're in a sense accumulating risk debt, right? You're barely keeping the lights on. You're doing what you can to not let the plates that are spinning fall down on the ground. And that actually ends up, in a sense, burning out, your best people, including yourself. And then what happens is usually after some sort of scare, but there can be other reasons that trigger it, is you get this feast part of the cycle. So there's a major incident, something bad happened. And usually what happens is the management team will write a blank check, right? But it's panic money in a sense. And so you go out, you buy expensive tools, you surge resources, you implement maybe draconian controls, right? Make everyone's life miserable. I just to show progress, right? The theater aspect of it, right? But to be blunt, the money will disappear, right? It's based on a panic, and once that happens, the cycle unfortunately repeats. And in the end, because we live in this kind of thrash, right? This cycle, it's really impossible to build operational maturity,
Yeah.
right? It's really hard to manage the risk just given this kind of whiplash that is happening, which again goes back to that theater topic.
Yeah.
And it's weird because psychologically speaking, it's like this very odd thing because it seems like budgets like this for security play out in almost every single company, right? And it's this kind of thrash cycle that, in my opinion, is what actually burns out a lot of really good CISOs, right? Because you can't live in thrash, right? It just doesn't work.
Yeah, I hear you. And like just one question along the same lines, right? So if you are living in trash and you're just like as a CISO wired for firefighting, right? You'd once told me that eventually your brain forgets how to do deep work. Can you talk that a little bit about that a little bit? Because I think a lot of leaders will quietly like resonate with that or recognize themselves in that firefighting mode and not able to do deep work mode, I guess.
Yeah, and to be clear, we're like putting the whole incident angle away, right? Like
Yeah.
there's things that come across from like incidents, and you got to deal with things that are part of the job. Unfortunately, because you exist in this kind of high thrash model, you ultimately become addicted to the urgent, right? You run from fire to get that next kind of hit. And as a result, you do feel good about yourself, right? When you get that hit, and that's because you're, I don't know, making progress, right? In a way, but in reality, it's a trap, right? You're in a sense because of this kind of constant state of being, you're rewiring your brain, right? And at some point, you're going to end up with the cognitive gear to kind of do that deep thought being lost. In a sense, you're not going to be able to like sit down and like let's say digest a 10-page white paper or start thinking about like longer term strategy. It it becomes physically painful to do those things, right? And you're in a sense more inclined to go do the urgent. So it's unfortunate.
I think that that kind of like applies to not just the role of a CISO, probably like every like leader that I've seen in different verticals. That's sort of like the same where the higher and higher you go, you sort of like live off of like incidents and milestones, right? And you like lose this ability to do deep thinking. But with CISOs, this is even more because first of all, you don't have the support to do it. Second thing is the model in itself is meant for firefighting, right? I think people are just trained for firefighting. That's where you come from, essentially,
Yeah.
right? So your ability to do deep thinking or like think strategically kind of like is going to decrease day by day. Love that.
Yeah, yeah. I think maybe a good cognitive model to look at is the role is, in a sense, almost like an emergency responder, but there's a nuance or a difference between a paramedic that is constantly arriving, let's say in an ambulance, right, and a doctor, right, that while can interject, let's say in an emergency room, but probably has some wider kind of bandwidth or vision or interaction with you with regards to a starting point and end point regarding your health. And so the question is, when we think about CISOs, what realm do we want them to live in? Do we want them to constantly be in the ambulance, right, arriving at a crash site, or do we want them to be able to manage the patient's health from a more holistic manner, right? But knowing that they can jump in the emergency room and perform that emergency surgery, right?
Yeah.
There's a huge difference there.
You'd mentioned once this do less with less, which
Oh
is
yeah.
completely opposite of a lot of people talk about like do more with less, especially in the era of like AI, right? People are often expecting every leader or every security leader for sure to do more with less because you have all of these new agents and things that are coming along, right? But you kind of like flipped that for me and you said like you as a CISO should be more aligned with do less with less. What does that mean?
First thing I'd like to say, the whole do more with less statement is kind of a fallacy, right? It's just mathematically impossible, right? Whether it's people, whether it's compute, whatever. If you want to do more things, you typically need more of something, right? There's a very famous physicist that said that matter, energy can't be destroyed, only exchanged, right? And so when I said, you as a CISO needs to do less with less, what I was actually meaning is you kind of need to look at the list of, let's say, 100 odd things that you need to go accomplish, understand, what your actual true capacity is and say, hey, based on what I have, I can only do these 5 things, but we're going to do them really well. And so in a sense, you're ruthlessly prioritizing out of that list the things that are most important, while at the same time being hyper transparent. So no theater to the business stakeholders and executives around, what is in scope, what is out of scope, what's being done, what's not being done, and ensuring that, again, changing kind of the dynamics of the ecosystem is that they have skin in the game around the ownership for those decisions that are actually being made. And so that's what I meant around doing less with less. It's not reading it on the surface. There's something underneath it.
One of the things that you had told us, right? Like I've always heard from you, don't build another dashboard, right? And like work toward an operating layer, kind of like a chief of staff that does the scaffolding, right? So from your perspective, what's the layer that's missing in most security programs? And why did you say don't build another dashboard?
To be blunt, CISOs, in my opinion, have plenty of visibility at this point, whether it's, dashboards, metrics, full discovery things, whatever, that goes to machine vision, you name it, right? It's just the problem is that operating layer, right? So, in a large enterprise, me as a CISO, I might have the luxury of, let's say, having a chief of staff or a program/portfolio manager, a master of GRC, some sort of strategy wing, you name it, right? When you start talking about mid-market CISOs, I'm going to be, in a sense, all of those people at once, or I'm stealing time from my already overworked team in order to kind of facilitate that.
Yeah.
And so as a result, most CISOs and kind of the mid-market space are drowning. Now, that's not to say that large enterprise CISOs don't have similar issues or similar challenges. It's just more, let's say, maybe visible with the mid-market folks. And so as a result, that missing layer is not more dashboards. Right. It's that operating layer, which is, why early on I kind of pushed you and the team to stop thinking of this as, a pure security tool and with security features, and in a sense kind of focus on, AI workers that are going to, build and kind of run that operating layer for CISOs.
Okay, my last question, and this is sort of like a section that I wanted to cover because, like, you've mentored many security leaders, whether it is through PAC or Teammate or your own advisory network, right? A first-time CISO called you tonight and said, "Tyson, I'm about to take my first role. What should I not screw up?" What would you tell them?
Maybe I talked them out of the job. I don't know.
Well,
No, I mean, to be blunt, I'm not going to state the common CISO first time CISO tropes, right? In my reply here. Instead, I'm going to give you maybe a slightly different angle. I think the first thing maybe is to actually try and not touch the tech within the first 90 days. Just ignore it if possible, right? Instead, I don't know, go take the CFO out for coffee. Go have lunch with the salesperson. Go sit down and actually, work with the frontline staff to do their job. Your goal should be to figure out how the company is actually making money, soup to nuts. Because if you don't dig in at that layer and have that kind of deep business understanding, you're honestly going to not know what to do in order to protect the business. I think the second thing is to maybe go find your generals. Going back to that like loneliness aspect of the job, if the company's not willing to kind of change that whole dynamic, you're not going to be able to survive alone, right? And you can't obviously go seek to change fundamentals of the company if they're not open to it.
yeah.
And so you're going to have to kind of look across the business and find the people that both have, let's say, the political capital, right, and are open to actually digging in into security and understanding, right? Make these folks your generals to kind of help drive the execution aspects so you're not doing it alone. I think the third thing would be to manage your own psychology. This job is going to take everything you give to it. If day one you don't, step back and try and set some boundaries, you're in a sense enabling yourself to be on all the time, right? Regardless if you have the staff or not. You're just basically studying the president, but I'm omnipresent, and what I would always encourage someone that's going into the role for the first time is don't be that person.
Yeah.
Right. Being a CISO is a job responsibility. It's a huge responsibility, but it should never consume you. It should never really define you. There's just so much more to life, in my opinion.
And that's the kind of stuff you don't get in a course or a certification. Thank you.
Oh no, they don't. They teach you to talk like a business executive and look at risk. And
Thank you. Thank you. So, and again, like, thank you for your time, Tyson, today. I really appreciate your honesty and for all the ways you've challenged us at Axari and for everything you do here for the community, right? Thank you for your time. And to
yeah,
everyone kind of like watching, if you heard yourself in any part of this conversation, you're not alone. The job is hard, the system is messy, but there are better operating models coming. And just kind of like wait and give it a try. So this was 10 Minutes with CISOs. I am Prasen. See you in the next one.